The morning of May 23, 1618, dawned clear over Prague. In the Hradčany Castle, the seat of Bohemian power, Protestant nobles gathered with the weight of grievance heavy on their shoulders. They had endured enough. The Catholic Habsburgs, those ancient masters of Europe, had pushed too far. Ferdinand II, soon to be Holy Roman Emperor, had closed Protestant churches. He had installed Catholic officials in Protestant lands. He had forgotten that power, like morning mist, can dissipate when the sun rises. Count Jindřich Matyáš Thurn led the delegation. A man of stern countenance and sterner convictions, he moved through the castle corridors like judgment incarnate. Behind him walked other Protestant nobles, their faces set in the grim determination of men who know they are about to cross a line from which there is no return. Their footsteps echoed against stone walls that had witnessed centuries of political theater, but nothing quite like what was about to unfold. In the council chamber, three men waited, Yaroslav Berida of Martinice and Vilém Slavata of Chlum, both Catholic governors appointed by Ferdinand, and Philip Fabricius, a secretary whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. They sat behind a heavy wooden table, documents spread before them like fallen leaves. The morning light streaming through the tall windows behind them would soon frame their flight. The Protestant nobles entered without ceremony. Count Thurn's voice, when he spoke, carried the authority of accumulated grievances. "Gentlemen," he said, his words measured and cold, "you have violated the letter of majesty. You have closed our churches, silenced our pastors, and trampled upon rights granted by your own Emperor Rudolf. What say you to these charges?" Martinice, a small man with the nervous energy of a cornered animal, rose to his feet. His voice trembled slightly as he replied, "We act according to the will of His Imperial Majesty Ferdinand. The churches in question were built without proper authorization. The letter of majesty does not extend to—" "Enough!" Count Thurn interrupted. The word fell like an executioner's axe. "We have heard these justifications before. They ring as hollow as empty church bells. You have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. What happened next would echo through the ages." The Protestant nobles surrounded the three Catholics. Hands seized arms and shoulders. Martinice cried out, his voice rising to a pitch of panic. Slavata tried to reason, to negotiate, but words had lost their power in that room. Only action remained. They dragged them to the window, the same window through which morning light had entered so peacefully minutes before. Martinice clawed at the window frame as they lifted him. Slavata prayed aloud in Latin, his words tumbling over each other in desperate haste. Fabricius, the secretary, simply stared in disbelief, as if his mind refused to process what was happening to him. "This," Count Thurn declared, "is how we deal with enemies of our faith and our freedom." One by one they threw them out. Martinice fell first, his small body spinning as it dropped. His scream tore through the morning air like fabric. Slavata followed, his arms windmilling uselessly as gravity claimed him. Finally Fabricius, silent now, resigned to his fate, fell like a stone into the castle moat below. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across all of Europe. In that moment, as three men lay groaning in a pile of refuse and manure that had, ironically, saved their lives, the old order died. The Holy Roman Empire, that ancient construct that had held Central Europe together for centuries, received a wound from which it would never fully recover. But the men who had thrown those bodies from the window could not know this yet. They could not see the armies that would march, the cities that would burn, the millions who would die. All they knew was the satisfaction of action taken, of grievances answered. They had made their statement. Now they would learn the price of making statements to emperors. News of the defenestration spread across Europe like wildfire. In Vienna, Ferdinand II received the report while at prayer. He was a thin man with the pale intensity of the truly devout, and he read the dispatch twice before setting it down with trembling hands. His advisors watched his face for any sign of his intentions, but Ferdinand had learned early the value of controlling his expressions. Only his eyes betrayed the storm building within. "Rebellion," he said quietly. The single word carried the weight of imperial authority and imperial wrath. Open rebellion against the crown and against God. In Prague, the Bohemian estates moved quickly to consolidate their revolution. They deposed Ferdinand as King of Bohemia, declared the throne vacant, and began the delicate work of finding a new monarch. They needed someone young, Protestant, and brave enough to defy the might of the Habsburg dynasty. They found their man in Frederick V, Elector Palatine, a 22-year-old Calvinist prince with more enthusiasm than experience. Frederick was everything Ferdinand was not. Young where Ferdinand was middle-aged, romantic where Ferdinand was calculating, optimistic where Ferdinand was grimly realistic. When the Bohemian crown was offered to him, Frederick saw glory and righteousness. His advisors saw the Habsburg armies that would inevitably follow. His wife, Elizabeth Stuart, daughter of King James I of England, saw adventure. History would remember him as the Winter King, for his reign would last barely a season. But before Frederick could even reach Prague to accept his crown, Ferdinand was moving. The Holy Roman Emperor understood that this was not merely about Bohemia. This was about the fundamental question of authority in Europe. If Protestant nobles could simply throw Catholic officials from windows and depose their rightful king, what would prevent every Protestant prince in the empire from following suit? The defenestration of Prague was not just an act of rebellion. It was a declaration that the old certainties were dead. Ferdinand turned to his allies with the methodical precision of a man accustomed to wielding power. The Catholic League, led by Duke Maximilian of Bavaria, pledged their support. Spain, the other great Habsburg power, promised gold and soldiers. The Pope himself offered his blessing and his treasury to the cause of restoring Catholic authority in Bohemia. But Ferdinand's most important ally would prove to be a man who cared nothing for religion and everything for profit. Albrecht von Wallenstein was a Bohemian noble who had converted from Protestantism to Catholicism not out of conviction but out of ambition. He was tall, gaunt, and perpetually calculating, with eyes that seemed to see not people but resources to be exploited. When Ferdinand needed an army, Wallenstein offered to raise one at his own expense, asking only for the right to recoup his investment through plunder and taxation of conquered territories. "Your Imperial Majesty," Wallenstein said during their first meeting, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had never met a problem he couldn't solve with sufficient application of violence and organization. "Armies are like any other business enterprise. They require investment, management, and a clear understanding of profit margins. I will give you the largest, best-equipped army in Europe. All I ask is the freedom to make it pay for itself." Ferdinand, pragmatist that he was beneath his religious convictions, agreed. He would later regret giving Wallenstein such latitude, but in 1618, faced with rebellion across his domains, he needed soldiers more than he needed scruples. As 1618 turned to 1619, armies began to move across the German lands like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Protestant and Catholic princes chose sides based on a complex calculus of religious conviction, political advantage, and personal ambition. The intricate web of alliances and obligations that held the Holy Roman Empire together began to strain and snap under the pressure. In Prague, Frederick V arrived to claim his throne with all the pomp and ceremony his supporters could muster. The young king processed through streets lined with cheering crowds, his beautiful wife beside him, both of them radiant with the confidence of youth and righteousness. The coronation ceremony in St. Vitus Cathedral was magnificent, a deliberate display of Protestant power and legitimacy. Frederick swore to defend the ancient liberties of Bohemia, to protect the Protestant faith, and to resist all tyranny. But even as Frederick spoke these noble words, Catholic armies were marching toward his borders. The die had been cast when 3 men fell from a Prague window, and now all of Europe would pay the price of that morning's violence. The first shots of what would become the 30 Years' War were fired not in some great set-piece battle, but in skirmishes along the borders between Catholic and Protestant lands. Patrols clashed in muddy fields, burned villages in retaliation for burned villages, and slowly, inexorably, drew their respective sides deeper into conflict. Each minor engagement created a grievance that demanded satisfaction. Each act of violence begot another, until the momentum of war became unstoppable. In the winter of 1619, as snow covered the battlefields and forced armies into winter quarters, both sides prepared for the greater conflicts to come. Frederick spent his time in Prague organizing his defenses and pleading with potential allies for support. His letters to his father-in-law, King James I of England, grew increasingly desperate as it became clear that England would not risk war with Spain for the sake of a son-in-law's dubious adventure. Ferdinand, meanwhile, methodically assembled the forces that would crush the Bohemian Rebellion. His correspondence with his Spanish cousins secured promises of men and money. His negotiations with the Catholic League ensured that Protestant princes would face not just imperial forces but the combined might of Catholic Germany. Most importantly, his agreement with Wallenstein guaranteed him an army that would be limited only by what the economic resources of Central Europe could sustain. Spring 1620 brought the end of the phony war and the beginning of real carnage. The Catholic armies, led by the competent and ruthless Johann Tserclaes, Count of Tilly, crossed into Bohemia like a plague of iron and gunpowder. Tilly was everything a general should be: experienced, careful, and absolutely merciless toward enemies of his faith and his emperor. His soldiers, a mixture of imperial troops and men of the Catholic League, had been hardened by campaigns against the Turks and rebellious princes. They moved through the Bohemian countryside with the systematic thoroughness of men who knew their business. Frederick's forces, brave but inexperienced, fell back toward Prague. The young king's commanders urged him to adopt a defensive strategy, to use Bohemia's natural advantages of terrain and interior lines to wear down the invaders. But Frederick, perhaps influenced by romantic notions of kingship, or perhaps simply unwilling to see his new realm devastated by a prolonged campaign, chose to risk everything on a single battle. The two armies met on November 8, 1620, at White Mountain, just outside Prague. In the morning mist that rose from the battlefield, 21,000 Protestant troops faced 27,000 Catholic soldiers. The odds were not impossible, but they required perfect execution and considerable luck. Frederick's army possessed neither. The battle began with an artillery duel that accomplished little except to announce to the world that the real war had finally begun. Cannonballs whistled through the air and crashed into the ranks of infantry, but both armies held their positions. It was when Tilly ordered his men forward that the fragility of Frederick's cause became apparent. The Protestant line, composed largely of Bohemian nobles who had never faced professional soldiers, wavered at the first contact. When Catholic cavalry struck their flanks, the wavering became a rout. Within 2 hours, Frederick's army had been shattered. Thousands lay dead on the field, while thousands more threw down their weapons and fled toward Prague, spreading panic in their wake. Frederick himself barely escaped capture. Accounts differ on whether he fought bravely or fled early, but the result was the same. The Winter King's reign was over before it had truly begun. He abandoned Prague that very night, taking his pregnant wife and what portable wealth they could gather. Behind them, they left a kingdom and a cause in ruins. The sack of Prague that followed was methodical and thorough. Tilly's soldiers, veterans of religious wars where quarter was rarely given and atrocities were commonplace, swept through the city like a hurricane of violence. Protestant churches were stripped of their valuables and rededicated to Catholic saints. Protestant nobles who had not fled fast enough were executed or imprisoned. The library of the Bohemian estates, containing thousands of irreplaceable manuscripts, was sold to foreign buyers or used as fuel for campfires. But the true horror was not in the grand gestures of conquest but in the small cruelties that followed. Protestant pastors were forced to convert or face exile. Families were torn apart as authorities searched for hidden heretics. Children were taken from Protestant parents and raised in Catholic institutions. The cultural and religious life of Bohemia, built up over generations, was systematically dismantled in a matter of months. Ferdinand's revenge was complete but costly. By crushing Bohemian independence so thoroughly, he had demonstrated to every Protestant prince in the empire what fate awaited those who defied Habsburg authority. But he had also made clear that compromise was impossible, that this was a war of extermination between two incompatible visions of Europe's future. The Winter King's brief reign was over, but the war that began with his defenestration of Prague had only just begun. Across the German lands, Protestant princes watched the destruction of Bohemia and drew their own conclusions. Some submitted to imperial authority, hoping to avoid Bohemia's fate. Others began secretly preparing for war, knowing that Frederick's defeat meant their own destruction was only a matter of time. In the Palatinate, Frederick's hereditary lands, Spanish armies were already moving to complete the destruction of Protestant power. The Rhineland, that crucial corridor between Spanish Italy and Spanish Netherlands, would become another battlefield in a war that was rapidly expanding beyond its original boundaries. Ferdinand had won his first victory, but in doing so, he had ensured that the conflict would spread like fire through dry grass across all of Central and Northern Europe. The defenestration of Prague had been answered with the Battle of White Mountain, but neither event had resolved the fundamental contradictions that divided Europe. They had only made clear that those contradictions could not be resolved through negotiation or compromise. As 1620 ended and 1621 began, the war entered a new phase. Frederick's rebellion had been crushed, but Frederick himself remained free, a living symbol of Protestant resistance to Habsburg domination. Spanish armies occupied the Palatinate, but other Protestant powers were beginning to consider intervention. The Holy Roman Empire had been preserved, but at the cost of internal unity that could never be fully restored. The men who had thrown 3 Catholics from a Prague window could not have imagined the consequences of their act. They had sought to defend their religious freedom and political autonomy. Instead, they had unleashed forces that would devastate Central Europe for a generation and transform the entire structure of European politics. In the burned churches and ruined cities of Bohemia, in the graves of those who died at White Mountain, in the tears of families torn apart by religious persecution, the true cost of that morning's defenestration was becoming clear. The war had begun with the sound of breaking glass and falling bodies. It would continue with the thunder of artillery and the screaming of the dying, across battlefields yet to be named, for 30 years that would seem like eternity to those who lived through them. But this was only the beginning. The defenestration had been answered, but the war itself had only just begun to gather momentum. Soon, other kingdoms would be drawn in, other armies would march, other cities would burn. The holy war that began in Prague would become a political war, a dynastic war, a war of pure survival that would consume everything in its path. The window had been shattered. Now all of Europe would fall through it, into 3 decades of darkness from which some nations would never fully emerge. Chapter 2. The Palatinate and Frederick the Winter King, 1619 to 1623. Kingdoms come and go, but ash remains. In the cold winter of 1620, as snow covered the blood-soaked field of White Mountain, Frederick V began his long journey into exile. The young man who had entered Prague as a king barely a year before now fled through the night like a common criminal, his pregnant wife Elizabeth beside him in a wagon that jolted over frozen roads. Behind them, the lights of Prague grew dim and distant, like a dream from which they had been rudely awakened. The Winter King, as history would remember him, had learned in the space of a single battle what it meant to defy the Habsburg dynasty. His reign had lasted exactly 1 winter, hence the cruel nickname that would follow him to his grave. But Frederick's personal tragedy was only the beginning of a greater catastrophe that would engulf his hereditary lands and spread like plague across the German states. Elizabeth, daughter of King James I of England, pressed her hand to her swollen belly as their wagon lurched through the darkness. The child she carried would be born in exile, a prince without a kingdom, heir to nothing but his father's broken dreams. She had been raised in the splendor of the English court, had married for love as much as politics, and had believed in her husband's cause with the fervor of youth. Now, as icy wind cut through the wagon's thin walls, she began to understand the price of idealism in a world governed by iron and gunpowder. Their destination was The Hague, where the Dutch Republic offered sanctuary to Protestant refugees. But the journey would take them through German lands where Catholic armies prowled like wolves, and where every inn and village posed potential danger. Frederick had become the most wanted man in Central Europe, a living symbol of Protestant resistance that Ferdinand II was determined to extinguish. As Frederick's party made their desperate flight westward, other forces were already moving to complete the destruction of his cause. Spanish armies, led by the experienced General Ambrosio Spinola, were marching northward from Italy toward the Palatinate, Frederick's ancestral lands along the Rhine. These were not the hasty forces of rebellion but professional soldiers hardened by decades of warfare in the Netherlands and Italy. The Palatinate was crucial to Spanish strategy in ways that went far beyond punishing a rebellious prince. The region controlled vital passes through which Spanish armies moved between their Italian and Netherlandish possessions. Spanish gold flowed along these routes, funding the endless wars that maintained Habsburg dominance across Europe. If Protestant powers could permanently hold the Palatinate, they could strangle Spanish logistics and potentially shift the balance of power across the continent. But the Palatinate was also valuable for reasons of faith. It was the heart of German Calvinism, home to the University of Heidelberg, where Protestant theologians had crafted some of the most sophisticated defenses of Reformed Christianity. Its churches were centers of Protestant learning and missionary activity that spread Calvinist doctrine throughout the German states. In Catholic eyes, the Palatinate was not just a political enemy but a source of spiritual infection that poisoned German Christianity. The military situation in the Palatinate was hopeless from the beginning. Frederick's supporters could field perhaps 25,000 men, mostly hastily raised militias and foreign volunteers drawn by Protestant solidarity or Spanish gold. Against them, Spanish and Bavarian forces would deploy over 40,000 professional soldiers, supported by the finest artillery trains in Europe and commanded by generals with decades of experience in siege warfare. General Spinola understood that this was not merely a military campaign but a political statement. Every town that fell, every fortress that surrendered, every Protestant stronghold that was reduced to rubble sent a message to Protestant princes throughout Germany. This is what happens to those who defy Catholic authority. The campaign would be methodical, ruthless, and absolutely decisive. The siege of Frankenthal began in the spring of 1621, as the last snows melted and revealed the stark reality of the Palatinate's vulnerability. The fortress, one of Frederick's strongest positions, was invested by Spanish forces with mathematical precision. Trenches were dug, batteries positioned, and the slow work of reduction began. Inside Frankenthal's walls, the garrison commander Sir Horace Vere, an English volunteer who had come to fight for Protestant liberty, watched the Spanish preparations with professional admiration and personal despair. Vere was a veteran of the Dutch wars, experienced in siegecraft, and he could see that Spinola's approach was flawless. The Spanish general was not gambling on a quick victory but preparing for a systematic destruction that could take months but would be absolutely certain. The bombardment, when it began, was unlike anything the defenders had experienced. Spanish artillery, some of the finest in Europe, pounded the walls with scientific precision. Each shot was calculated, each battery positioned to create maximum destruction while minimizing Spanish casualties. The defenders replied with their lighter guns, but their fire was hasty and largely ineffective against Spanish earthworks that had been constructed by engineers who understood their craft. Day after day, the bombardment continued. The walls of Frankenthal, built in an earlier age when artillery was less powerful, began to crumble under the systematic pounding. Gaps appeared in the fortifications, gaps that grew wider with each passing day. Inside the fortress, food grew short, ammunition ran low, and hope died by degrees. But it was not just military pressure that broke the defenders' will. Spanish propaganda, distributed through the surrounding countryside, promised mercy to those who surrendered quickly and threatened terrible retribution for those who resisted to the end. Stories circulated of other towns that had defied Spanish arms and been reduced to ash and bone. The message was clear: submit now or face annihilation. On a gray morning in July 1621, a white flag appeared on Frankenthal's shattered walls. Sir Horace Vere, his honor intact but his cause lost, requested terms for surrender. Spinola, magnanimous in victory, granted generous conditions to a brave enemy. The garrison would be allowed to march out with colors flying and arms in hand, free to join other Protestant forces. It was a gesture of professional respect between soldiers, but it could not disguise the reality that Protestant resistance in the Palatinate was crumbling. The fall of Frankenthal opened the floodgates of Spanish advance. Town after town submitted without siege, their populations cowed by reports of Spanish military efficiency and Catholic mercy toward the compliant. The great fortress of Heidelberg, seat of Palatine power and center of German Calvinist learning, held out for barely 2 months before its walls were breached and its defenders overwhelmed. The sack of Heidelberg was methodical and complete. Spanish soldiers, veterans of Italian and Netherlandish campaigns, knew their business. They stripped the city of portable wealth, loaded wagons with gold and silver ornaments from Protestant churches, and sent wagon loads of plunder southward toward Spanish territories. But the real treasure was the university's famous library, one of the greatest collections of books and manuscripts in Germany. The Palatine Library, as it was known, contained over 5,000 manuscripts and 13,000 printed books, including many of the foundational texts of German Protestantism. Duke Maximilian of Bavaria, leader of the Catholic League and Spinola's ally in the campaign, claimed this intellectual treasure as his personal prize. The entire library was carefully packed and shipped to Rome, where it was presented to Pope Gregory XV as a trophy of Catholic victory over heretical learning. The symbolism was profound and intentional. Protestant intellectual life, Protestant scholarship, Protestant claims to theological legitimacy were being literally carted away in wagons, delivered to the Vatican as proof that the Counter-Reformation was succeeding. German Calvinism was not merely being defeated militarily. It was being intellectually decapitated. But the physical destruction was even more devastating than the cultural loss. Spanish engineers, following Spinola's orders, systematically demolished Heidelberg's fortifications. The great castle that had dominated the Neckar Valley for centuries was reduced to ruins that would never be completely rebuilt. Churches were rededicated to Catholic saints, Protestant pastors were exiled or forced to convert, and the entire religious and cultural life of the region was transformed according to Catholic specifications. Frederick, watching from his exile in The Hague, received reports of his homeland's destruction with the numb horror of a man witnessing his own funeral. Each town that fell, each fortress that surrendered, each church that was rededicated to Catholic worship marked another step in the erasure of everything he had inherited and everything he had tried to defend. The Palatinate was not just being conquered. It was being methodically erased and rebuilt according to enemy specifications. Elizabeth tried to comfort her husband as the terrible news arrived letter by letter, but her own grief was too deep for consolation. She had given birth to their son Maurice in exile, and the child would grow up never seeing the lands he should have inherited. The family lived on charity from the Dutch Republic and what little financial support Elizabeth's father in England was willing to provide. Their reduced circumstances, so different from the splendor they had known, were a daily reminder of their fall from grace. The psychological impact of Frederick's destruction extended far beyond his personal tragedy. Protestant princes throughout Germany watched the systematic annihilation of the Palatinate and drew their own conclusions about the costs of resistance. Some, like the Elector of Brandenburg, hastily made their peace with Ferdinand II, offering submission in exchange for continued rule over their territories. Others began secret negotiations with foreign powers, seeking allies who might be willing to intervene against Habsburg dominance. But most simply waited, paralyzed by the magnitude of Spanish military efficiency and the obvious futility of resistance. The Holy Roman Empire, that complex web of principalities and free cities that had maintained a delicate balance between Catholic and Protestant authority, was being transformed into a Habsburg-dominated system where religious and political autonomy existed only at imperial sufferance. The campaign in the Palatinate demonstrated something that would characterize the entire 30 Years' War. The conflict was becoming as much about power and territory as about religion. Spanish occupation of the Palatinate was strategically vital for maintaining communication between Spanish Italy and the Spanish Netherlands, regardless of the religious complexion of the territory's population. Ferdinand II's granting of Frederick's electoral dignity to Maximilian of Bavaria rewarded Catholic loyalty, while simultaneously strengthening Habsburg influence in the Imperial Electoral College. The war was evolving beyond its origins in Bohemian religious grievances into something larger and more complex, a struggle for the fundamental structure of European power. Religion remained important, providing ideological justification and popular motivation, but increasingly it was becoming subordinate to calculations of state interest and dynastic ambition. As 1622 dawned, the destruction of Frederick's cause seemed complete. His armies had been scattered, his territories occupied, his allies intimidated into submission or neutrality. The Winter King himself lived on Dutch charity, a broken man who had gambled everything on a single throw of the dice and lost. The Protestant cause in Germany appeared finished, crushed by the combined might of Spanish professionalism and Bavarian determination. But appearances in the 30 Years' War were often deceiving. Even as Spanish banners flew over Heidelberg's ruins and Catholic priests rededicated Protestant churches throughout the Palatinate, new forces were stirring that would transform the conflict once again. In Denmark, King Christian IV was watching Spanish success with growing alarm and considering intervention to restore Protestant fortunes. In France, Cardinal Richelieu was calculating whether Habsburg dominance in Germany threatened French security. In Sweden, King Gustavus Adolphus was building the most efficient military machine in Europe and wondering whether German weakness offered opportunities for northern expansion. The Winter King had fallen, but winter would eventually end. The question was not whether the war would continue, but how many more kingdoms would burn before it finally ended. Frederick's personal tragedy had become Europe's collective nightmare, and the nightmare was only beginning to unfold in all its terrible complexity. In the ruins of Heidelberg, in the empty halls of the great castle, the wind whistled through broken stones and scattered the ashes of burned books. The Palatinate had been conquered, but the war that had begun with the defenestration of Prague continued to spread like fire through dry grass. The Winter King was finished, but the 30 years of winter had only just begun. The lessons of Frederick's destruction would not be lost on other Protestant powers. They had seen what happened to princes who challenged Habsburg authority without sufficient preparation, without reliable allies, without the military resources necessary to sustain a long war against professional enemies. When intervention came, it would be more carefully planned, more thoroughly prepared, and far more devastating in its consequences. But that intervention was still years away. For now, Catholic Europe could celebrate the restoration of religious and political order in the German lands. The rebellion that had begun with broken glass and falling bodies seemed finally crushed. Ferdinand too could turn his attention to other pressing matters of imperial governance, secure in the knowledge that Protestant resistance had been broken and Habsburg authority restored. They could not know that the worst was yet to come. They could not foresee the armies that would march, the cities that would burn, the millions who would die before the war finally ended. The Winter King had been defeated, but the long winter of European warfare had barely begun. Chapter 3. The Danish Phase, 1625 to 1629. He did not pray for peace. He counted profit. The sound of cannon fire echoed across the Baltic Sea in the spring of 1625, carrying with it the promise of new intervention and fresh catastrophe. Christian IV of Denmark, a monarch of boundless ambition and questionable judgment, had watched the destruction of Frederick's Protestant cause with growing alarm and calculation. The systematic Spanish conquest of the Palatinate had demonstrated that Habsburg power was expanding northward like a rising tide, threatening to engulf the entire Protestant world unless someone had the courage to stand against it. Christian was 58 years old, a giant of a man who stood nearly 7 feet tall and possessed the temperament to match his physical stature. He had ruled Denmark for over 40 years, transforming his kingdom from a minor Baltic power into a significant European force through a combination of military aggression, commercial expansion, and diplomatic cunning. But Christian was more than just another ambitious monarch. He was a man intoxicated by his own success, convinced that his string of victories against Sweden, Russia, and various German princes proved his invincibility. The Danish king's decision to intervene in the German war was motivated by a complex mixture of religious conviction, political calculation, and personal ambition. As a Lutheran monarch, Christian genuinely feared the Catholic resurgence that Ferdinand II's victories represented. The systematic destruction of Protestant political authority in Bohemia and the Palatinate suggested that Lutheran Germany might be next on the imperial agenda. But Christian's concerns were not purely religious, they were deeply practical. Denmark's economy depended heavily on control of the Baltic trade routes and the sound dues that Danish fortresses collected from ships passing between the Baltic and North Seas. If Habsburg power extended to the Baltic coast, if Catholic armies occupied the German ports that generated so much Danish revenue, then Denmark's prosperity and perhaps its independence would be threatened. Christian was defending not just Protestant Christianity but Danish commercial interests that had taken decades to establish. The king's strategy was bold but fundamentally flawed. He would invade northern Germany with a Danish army, link up with whatever Protestant forces remained in the field, and drive the Catholic armies back before they could consolidate their conquests. Speed and surprise would compensate for numerical disadvantage, while Danish naval supremacy would ensure secure supply lines and prevent Catholic reinforcement from the south. It was a plan that might have worked against a conventional enemy, but Christian was about to face an opponent unlike any that Europe had yet produced. Albrecht von Wallenstein was a phenomenon that the traditional aristocratic military establishment could not understand or counter. Born into minor Bohemian nobility, he had converted from Protestantism to Catholicism not out of religious conviction but out of calculated ambition. Through a strategic marriage to a wealthy widow and ruthless exploitation of the chaos following the Battle of White Mountain, Wallenstein had accumulated vast estates and enormous liquid capital. But unlike other war profiteers who were content to supply armies, Wallenstein proposed to create and command his own. When Ferdinand II found himself short of funds to maintain the large armies necessary to secure his recent conquests, Wallenstein presented a revolutionary proposal. He would raise, equip, and maintain an imperial army of 50,000 men at his own expense, asking only for the right to recoup his investment through taxation and requisition in occupied territories. The army would be entirely professional, recruited from across Europe without regard to religion or nationality, and commanded according to the most modern military principles. Ferdinand, desperate for military resources and impressed by Wallenstein's obvious competence, agreed to terms that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. He granted Wallenstein virtually unlimited authority to raise troops, levy taxes, and administer conquered territories. The traditional aristocratic officer corps, men who traced their military service back generations and considered warfare a noble profession governed by ancient codes of honor, watched with dismay as this upstart businessman transformed warfare into an industrial enterprise. Wallenstein's approach to military organization was coldly rational and utterly modern. He recruited soldiers based on professional competence rather than social standing, paying them regularly and training them systematically. His supply trains were organized with merchant efficiency, his artillery parks maintained by specialists who understood their craft, his intelligence network staffed by professionals who gathered information rather than glory. Most importantly, his armies were expected to pay for themselves through systematic exploitation of occupied territories. This last innovation was perhaps the most revolutionary and most destructive. Traditional armies had always lived off the land to some extent, but Wallenstein systematized the process into what amounted to legalized extortion. His quartermasters assessed the economic capacity of occupied regions with merchant precision, extracting the maximum possible tribute without quite destroying the productive capacity that generated wealth. Villages were required to provide not just food and fodder but cash payments calculated according to their estimated ability to pay. The psychological effect of this system was devastating. Previous armies had looted randomly and moved on, leaving communities to recover as best they could. Wallenstein's forces occupied territories permanently, extracting wealth with mechanical efficiency month after month, year after year. For the civilian population, the new system was far worse than traditional military brutality because it was so systematic, so inescapable, so utterly without hope of relief. Christian IV, unaware that he was about to face this revolutionary form of warfare, crossed into Germany in the late spring of 1625 with high hopes and an army of 35,000 men. His forces were well equipped by contemporary standards, disciplined by years of Baltic warfare, and commanded by experienced officers who had learned their craft in successful campaigns against weaker enemies. The Danish king himself rode at their head, magnificent in his gilded armor, confident that his personal leadership would inspire his men to victory against Catholic tyranny. The initial Danish advance proceeded smoothly enough. Christian's armies occupied several important towns in Lower Saxony, linked up with surviving Protestant forces, and began the systematic reduction of Catholic strongholds. For a few months, it seemed that the Danish intervention might succeed in reversing Catholic gains and restoring Protestant fortunes in northern Germany. Christians' propaganda trumpeted these early successes as proof that God favored the Protestant cause and that Habsburg dominance was not inevitable. But Wallenstein was methodically assembling his response. From his headquarters in Prague, he coordinated the movement of forces with the efficiency of a merchant organizing a trade expedition. Regiments marched from Hungary, Bohemia, and Austria according to carefully planned schedules. Supply trains moved along predetermined routes, carrying not just immediate military necessities, but the administrative apparatus necessary to transform military occupation into systematic exploitation. The general himself was a figure who inspired both admiration and terror among his subordinates. Tall, gaunt, and perpetually calculating, Wallenstein seemed to view warfare as an enormous mathematical problem that could be solved through sufficient application of logic and resources. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words carried absolute authority. His staff officers, drawn from across Europe and selected purely for competence, executed his orders with mechanical precision. Wallenstein's personal habits were as systematic as his military methods. He rose before dawn, spent hours reviewing intelligence reports and supply manifests, and planned his campaigns with the meticulous attention to detail that a merchant might devote to a complex commercial venture. He ate sparingly, dressed simply despite his enormous wealth, and maintained emotional distance from subordinates who served him with a mixture of respect and fear. The confrontation between Christian's traditional military approach and Wallenstein's systematic professionalism came to a head in the summer of 1626. The Danish king, seeking to force a decisive battle before Wallenstein could fully concentrate his forces, advanced toward the imperial army's positions near the town of Lutter. Christian commanded approximately 40,000 men, a substantial force that included some of the finest infantry and cavalry in northern Europe. Wallenstein faced this challenge with 35,000 troops, but his forces possessed crucial advantages that were not immediately apparent. His soldiers were better supplied, more systematically trained, and commanded by officers who understood modern warfare's technical requirements. Most importantly, Wallenstein himself was a general who fought with his mind rather than his emotions, calculating odds and managing resources rather than seeking personal glory. The Battle of Lutter, fought on August 27, 1626, demonstrated the superiority of systematic preparation over traditional military virtues. Christian's forces attacked with the courage and clan that had served them well in previous campaigns, but they found themselves facing enemies who fought with cold efficiency rather than passionate conviction. Wallenstein's artillery, positioned with mathematical precision, tore gaps in the Danish lines before the infantry could close to effective range. When the Danish cavalry charged, seeking to break through imperial positions and reach Wallenstein's command post, they found themselves channeled into carefully prepared killing zones where concentrated musket fire and prepositioned artillery could destroy them piecemeal. Christian himself led several desperate charges, his massive frame making him an unmistakable target, but courage could not overcome systematic preparation. By evening, the Danish army was in full retreat. Christian had lost over 6,000 men and most of his artillery, while Wallenstein's casualties were minimal. The Danish king, wounded and demoralized, fell back toward the Baltic coast with the remnants of his forces. Behind him, Wallenstein's armies advanced methodically, occupying Danish positions and implementing the systematic exploitation that would soon become infamous throughout northern Germany. The victory at Lutter established Wallenstein as the most feared general in Europe, but more importantly, it demonstrated that warfare had fundamentally changed. Traditional military virtues, personal courage, aristocratic leadership, religious fervor, were becoming subordinate to systematic organization, professional competence, and mathematical calculation of resources. The Romantic age of warfare was ending, replaced by something colder and more efficient. Christian's retreat became a rout as Wallenstein's forces pursued the defeated Danes with relentless efficiency. Town after town fell to imperial forces, their populations subjected to the systematic taxation that funded Wallenstein's military machine. The general's quartermasters moved through occupied territories like accountants, assessing economic capacity and extracting tribute with merchant precision. But it was not just the systematic exploitation that demoralized the population, it was the obvious permanence of Wallenstein's occupation. Previous armies had come and gone, But Wallenstein's forces settled into regions as if they intended to stay forever. Administrative structures were established, tax collection systematized, and resistance crushed with the methodical thoroughness of men who viewed rebellion as a business problem to be solved. The psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate military situation. Protestant princes throughout Germany watched Wallenstein's systematic reduction of Danish power and concluded that traditional military resistance was futile. The general's armies seemed less like conventional military forces than like some new form of organized violence that could not be defeated through courage or religious conviction. Christian himself, reduced to defending the Danish islands with the remnants of his army, sent increasingly desperate appeals to potential allies. England, France, Sweden, the Dutch Republic all received Danish requests for military intervention or financial support. But European powers were beginning to understand that intervention against Wallenstein meant facing not just another army but an entirely new form of military organization that conventional forces could not match. The Danish king's situation became hopeless during the winter of 1627 to 1628, as Wallenstein's forces occupied the entire Baltic coast and prepared to extend imperial control into Denmark proper. Christian's naval supremacy, which had seemed to guarantee secure communications and supply lines, proved meaningless when Wallenstein could deny him access to continental ports and resources. The general's strategic vision extended beyond immediate military considerations to encompass the entire economic and political structure of Northern Europe. By controlling Baltic ports, he could strangle the trade that supported Danish prosperity. By systematically exploiting occupied territories, he could generate the resources necessary to maintain imperial armies indefinitely. By demonstrating the futility of resistance, he could intimidate potential enemies into submission without the expense of additional campaigns. Ferdinand II, watching from Vienna as his general systematically dismantled Danish power, began to understand that he had created something he could not entirely control. Wallenstein's armies were technically imperial forces, but they operated according to the general's strategic vision rather than traditional imperial policy. The systematic exploitation of occupied territories generated enormous revenues, but those revenues flowed through Wallenstein's hands rather than directly to the imperial treasury. More troubling still, Wallenstein's success was creating a new model of military organization that threatened traditional aristocratic privilege. If armies could be raised and maintained by businessmen rather than hereditary nobles, if military commands could be granted based on competence rather than birth, if warfare itself could be transformed into a commercial enterprise, then what role remained for the traditional military aristocracy that had dominated European warfare for centuries? These concerns would eventually lead to Wallenstein's dismissal and assassination, but in 1628, the general seemed unstoppable. His armies controlled the Baltic coast from Schleswig to Pomerania. His administrative apparatus extracted tribute from occupied territories with mechanical efficiency, and his strategic vision encompassed the transformation of the Holy Roman Empire into a centralized state dominated by Habsburg authority. Christian IV, faced with the complete collapse of his German intervention, was forced to seek peace on whatever terms Ferdinand II would grant. The Treaty of Lübeck, signed in May 1629, restored Christian's Danish territories but required him to renounce all involvement in German affairs. The Danish king, who had entered the war as a crusader for Protestant liberty, departed as a defeated monarch who had learned the cost of challenging imperial authority. The Danish phase of the 30 Years' War was over, but its lessons reverberated throughout Europe. Wallenstein had demonstrated that systematic organization and professional competence could defeat traditional military virtues. The general's armies had shown that warfare could be transformed into a self-sustaining commercial enterprise that generated its own resources through systematic exploitation of occupied territories. Most importantly, the Danish intervention had revealed the futility of piecemeal resistance to imperial authority. Christian's defeat proved that individual Protestant powers, no matter how determined or well-equipped, could not successfully challenge the combined might of Habsburg resources and Wallenstein's systematic military organization. Future interventions would require more careful preparation, more reliable allies, and more innovative approaches to the revolutionary form of warfare that Wallenstein had created. As the Danish armies sailed home across the Baltic, leaving behind the burned villages and systematically exploited territories that marked their path through Germany, the war entered a new phase. Protestant hopes, raised by Christian's initial successes, had been crushed more thoroughly than ever before. Imperial authority seemed unshakable, Wallenstein's armies appeared invincible, and the Catholic resurgence that had begun with Ferdinand's victory in Bohemia seemed destined to transform all of Central Europe. But appearances, as always in the 30 Years' War, were deceiving. Even as Wallenstein's quartermasters counted their tribute and his administrators consolidated imperial control over northern Germany, new forces were stirring that would transform the conflict once again. In Sweden, a young king was watching German events with calculating eyes and building an army that would challenge everything Wallenstein had achieved. The Danish phase was ending, but the Swedish intervention would prove far more devastating and far more decisive than anything Europe had yet witnessed. The war that had begun with broken glass and falling bodies continued to spread and evolve, consuming everything in its path. Christian IV had learned the cost of challenging imperial authority, but his defeat had also demonstrated the weaknesses in Wallenstein's seemingly invincible system. The Danish intervention was over, but the long winter of European warfare was far from finished. Chapter 4. The Swedish Phase, 1630 to 1635. He lit hope, and was extinguished in smoke. Across the grey waters of the Baltic Sea, in the granite halls of Stockholm's royal palace, a young king studied maps of Germany with the intensity of a scholar and the calculation of a predator. Gustavus II Adolphus of Sweden was 35 years old in the summer of 1630, a monarch who combined intellectual brilliance with military genius in proportions that appeared perhaps once in a century. While Christian IV sailed home in defeat and Wallenstein's administrators counted their tribute from conquered territories, the Swedish king was preparing an intervention that would transform not just the German war but the entire art of warfare itself. Gustavus was tall and powerfully built, with the fair hair and blue eyes of his northern heritage, but it was his mind rather than his physical presence that made him formidable. He spoke 9 languages fluently, had mastered mathematics and engineering, and possessed an intuitive understanding of military technology that enabled him to revolutionize battlefield tactics. More importantly, he combined intellectual curiosity with practical ruthlessness in ways that would have impressed Wallenstein himself. The Swedish king's decision to intervene in Germany was motivated by a complex mixture of strategic necessity, religious conviction, and personal ambition that reflected the sophisticated political calculations of a ruler who understood power in all its dimensions. Sweden's position as the dominant Baltic power was threatened by imperial expansion toward the northern coasts. If Wallenstein's armies permanently occupied German ports, if Habsburg authority extended to the Baltic trade routes that funded Swedish prosperity, then Sweden's hard-won independence and regional dominance would be compromised. But Gustavus was also a deeply religious man, a Lutheran who genuinely believed that God had called him to defend Protestant Christianity against Catholic resurgence. The systematic destruction of Protestant political authority in Germany, the methodical conversion of Protestant churches to Catholic worship, the exile of Protestant pastors, and the persecution of Protestant populations. All of this offended the Swedish king's religious convictions as much as it threatened his political interests. Most importantly, Gustavus possessed something that previous Protestant champions had lacked: a clear understanding of what military innovations would be necessary to defeat Wallenstein's systematic approach to warfare. The Swedish king had spent years studying the Danish defeat, analyzing intelligence reports about imperial military organization, and developing tactical responses to the challenges that Wallenstein's professionalism presented. The Swedish army that assembled for the German campaign was unlike anything Europe had yet seen. Gustavus had systematically modernized Swedish military organization, creating forces that combined traditional Scandinavian military virtues with revolutionary technological and tactical innovations. Swedish infantry carried lighter muskets that could be fired more rapidly than traditional weapons, supported by artillery pieces that were more mobile and more accurate than conventional cannon. But the real revolution was in military organization and tactical doctrine. Swedish armies were structured according to mathematical principles, with standardized unit sizes and carefully calculated ratios between different types of troops. Infantry, cavalry, and artillery were trained to coordinate their actions with unprecedented precision, creating combined arms capabilities that multiplied the effectiveness of individual components. Gustavus himself had developed these innovations through years of warfare against Poland and Russia, conflicts that had served as laboratories for testing new approaches to military problems. The Swedish king was not just a gifted amateur but a professional soldier who understood warfare as both art and science. His reforms created armies that were simultaneously more efficient and more flexible than traditional forces, capable of adapting to unexpected situations while maintaining disciplined effectiveness. The Swedish military system was also revolutionary in its approach to logistics and administration. Unlike Wallenstein's forces, which sustained themselves through systematic exploitation of occupied territories, Swedish armies carried their own supplies and paid for what they requisitioned. This approach was more expensive in the short term but created crucial political advantages by avoiding the popular hostility that Wallenstein's taxation policies generated. Swedish propaganda, distributed throughout Protestant Germany, emphasized these differences between Swedish liberation and imperial occupation. Where Wallenstein's forces brought systematic exploitation, Swedish armies would bring religious freedom and political autonomy. Where imperial administration extracted tribute, Swedish protection would restore traditional German liberties. The message was carefully crafted to appeal to both religious conviction and economic self-interest. Gustavus landed in Germany in July 1630 with an army of 43,000 men, but his initial reception was less enthusiastic than Swedish propaganda had predicted. Protestant princes, intimidated by Wallenstein's systematic destruction of previous resistance, were reluctant to support another intervention that might bring imperial retribution upon their territories. The systematic nature of Wallenstein's previous campaigns had created a climate of fear that made potential allies cautious about committing themselves to Swedish leadership. The Swedish king's first months in Germany were spent in careful political maneuvering as much as military positioning. Gustavus understood that military success alone would not be sufficient. He needed to build a coalition of German allies who could provide local knowledge, additional troops, and political legitimacy for Swedish intervention. This required delicate negotiations with princes who had learned to distrust foreign promises and fear imperial retribution. The breakthrough came with the sack of Magdeburg in May 1631, an event that shocked Protestant Germany and demonstrated the true nature of imperial military policy. The city, one of Germany's most important Protestant centers, had declared for Gustavus despite imperial demands for submission. When Magdeburg's defenders proved unable to hold their positions against systematic imperial assault, the city fell to forces commanded by Johann Tserkles, Count of Tilly, Wallenstein's rival and the most experienced Catholic general in Germany. What followed was not a conventional military occupation but an orgy of destruction that seemed to serve no rational military or political purpose. Imperial soldiers, their discipline collapsed in the heat of assault, burned and looted the city with systematic thoroughness. Contemporary accounts describe streets filled with corpses, churches stripped of their ornaments, and residential districts reduced to smoking ruins. Of Magdeburg's 30,000 inhabitants, perhaps 5,000 survived the massacre. The destruction of Magdeburg was strategically counterproductive for imperial policy, but it served Swedish interests perfectly. Protestant propaganda throughout Germany emphasized the contrast between imperial brutality and Swedish protection, between Catholic systematic destruction and Lutheran liberation. Prince after prince, previously reluctant to support Swedish intervention, now sought Gustavus's protection against imperial forces that seemed capable of any atrocity. The psychological impact of Magdeburg's destruction extended far beyond immediate political calculations. For Protestant populations throughout Germany, the city's fate demonstrated that imperial mercy was an illusion, that submission would not guarantee safety, that only military victory could provide security against Catholic systematic violence. The massacre had eliminated the middle ground between resistance and collaboration, forcing Protestant Germany to choose between Swedish protection and imperial destruction. Gustavus exploited this political transformation with the skill of a master diplomatist. Swedish agents, operating throughout Protestant Germany, negotiated alliances that provided the Swedish army with German allies, local intelligence, and political legitimacy. The most important of these agreements was the alliance with John George, Elector of Saxony, a cautious prince who had previously sought neutrality, but now recognized that neutrality was impossible in a war where cities could be destroyed for symbolic purposes. The military confrontation between Swedish innovation and imperial tradition came to a head in September 1631 at the Battle of Breitenfeld, near Leipzig. Tilly, commanding a combined imperial and Catholic League army of 36,000 men, faced Gustavus's forces of 42,000 troops that included both Swedish regulars and Saxon allies. On paper, the forces seemed evenly matched, but the battle would demonstrate that military innovation could triumph over traditional superiority. Tilly was 67 years old, a veteran of countless campaigns who had learned his craft in an earlier era when warfare moved at a more deliberate pace. His forces were organized according to traditional principles, with massive infantry formations supported by heavy cavalry and positioned artillery. These tactics had served Tilly well in previous campaigns, but they were designed for a style of warfare that Swedish innovations had made obsolete. Gustavus positioned his forces according to revolutionary tactical principles that emphasized flexibility and mutual support between different types of troops. Swedish infantry was organized in smaller, more maneuverable formations that could respond quickly to changing battlefield conditions. Artillery was distributed throughout the army rather than concentrated in fixed positions, providing direct support for advancing troops. Most importantly, Swedish cavalry was trained to coordinate closely with infantry and artillery, creating combined arms capabilities that conventional forces could not match. The battle began at dawn with an artillery duel that immediately demonstrated Swedish technical superiority. Swedish cannon, lighter and more maneuverable than conventional artillery, were repositioned throughout the engagement to provide optimal fire support. Imperial artillery, positioned according to traditional principles, proved unable to respond effectively to this tactical flexibility. When Tilly ordered his infantry forward in the massive formations that had dominated European battlefields for generations, they found themselves facing enemies who fought according to entirely different principles. Swedish infantry, supported by mobile artillery and coordinated cavalry attacks, disrupted imperial formations before they could close to effective range. The famous Spanish tercios, those disciplined infantry squares that had dominated European warfare for over a century, proved vulnerable to Swedish tactical innovations that emphasized firepower and mobility over mass and discipline. The Saxon troops on Gustavus's left flank fled early in the battle, threatening to expose the Swedish army to envelopment, but the Swedish king responded to this crisis with a tactical brilliance that would make him legendary. Rather than attempting to restore his original battle line, Gustavus repositioned his forces to take advantage of the Saxon withdrawal, using it as an opportunity to attack the exposed imperial flank with concentrated Swedish reserves. The result was a complete imperial collapse. Tilly's army, organized according to tactical principles that assumed battlefield stability and predictable enemy responses, proved unable to adapt to Swedish innovations that emphasized rapid response to changing conditions. Imperial casualties exceeded 13,000 men, including most of their artillery and baggage train, while Swedish losses were minimal. More importantly, the Battle of Breitenfeld demonstrated to all of Europe that Wallenstein's military system was not invincible, that systematic organization could be defeated by tactical innovation, that imperial authority could be successfully challenged by forces that understood modern warfare's requirements. The psychological impact of Swedish victory extended far beyond immediate military consequences to encompass the fundamental question of whether Habsburg dominance could be successfully resisted. Gustavus exploited his victory with the same systematic efficiency that had characterized his military innovations. Swedish armies advanced deep into Catholic Germany, liberating Protestant territories and implementing the political and religious reforms that Swedish propaganda had promised. But unlike previous Protestant interventions, Swedish occupation was carefully managed to avoid the systematic exploitation that had characterized Wallenstein's approach. Swedish administrators, trained in the efficient governmental methods that had modernized Sweden itself, restored Protestant worship while maintaining economic productivity. Swedish soldiers, better disciplined and more regularly paid than conventional armies, avoided the random violence that typically characterized military occupation. Most importantly, Swedish policy emphasized the restoration of traditional German liberties rather than the imposition of foreign domination. The political transformation of Germany accelerated as Swedish armies advanced toward the Rhine. Prince after prince declared for Gustavus, seeking Swedish protection against imperial retribution and Swedish assistance in restoring traditional autonomy. The complex web of alliances and obligations that held the Holy Roman Empire together began to unravel as princes calculated that Swedish power offered better prospects than imperial authority. Ferdinand II, watching from Vienna as Swedish armies systematically dismantled imperial control over northern Germany, was forced to recall Wallenstein from the retirement that imperial suspicions had imposed upon him. The general's systematic exploitation of occupied territories had created political problems. His independent authority had threatened traditional aristocratic privilege, but his military competence was essential for responding to Swedish innovations. Wallenstein's return to command in 1632 marked the beginning of a new phase in the conflict, as the two most innovative military minds of their generation prepared to test their respective approaches to warfare. The general's systematic organization faced Swedish tactical flexibility, imperial systematic exploitation confronted Swedish political sophistication, traditional military hierarchy challenged innovative combined arms coordination. The campaign of 1632 demonstrated that both military systems possessed significant advantages and serious weaknesses. Wallenstein's armies, reinforced and reorganized during his recall, proved capable of matching Swedish tactical innovations through their own systematic approach to military problems. Swedish forces, operating far from their secure supply bases, discovered that tactical superiority could not entirely compensate for strategic overextension. The confrontation between these two military systems came to its climax at the Battle of Lutzen in November 1632. Wallenstein, commanding 18,000 men in carefully prepared defensive positions, faced Gustavus's army of 20,000 troops that included Swedish regulars, German allies, and mercenary contingents. Both armies were veteran forces commanded by generals who understood their craft, and the battle would test the limits of military innovation and systematic organization. The morning of November 16th dawned gray and foggy, conditions that favored Wallenstein's defensive strategy by reducing the effectiveness of Swedish artillery and limiting the mobility that was crucial to Swedish tactical success. Gustavus, recognizing these disadvantages, nevertheless decided to attack rather than allow Wallenstein to choose more favorable circumstances for battle. The fighting was intense and confused, with both armies demonstrating the professional competence that systematic training and experienced leadership could create. Swedish tactical innovations proved effective against Wallenstein's defensive preparations, but imperial forces responded with the disciplined resilience that the general's systematic approach had developed. Neither side could achieve decisive advantage through purely military means. The battle's outcome was determined not by systematic organization or tactical innovation, but by a single moment of personal tragedy that would transform the entire course of European history. Gustavus, leading a cavalry charge against imperial positions, was struck by multiple musket balls and fell from his horse in the thick fog that obscured the battlefield. The Swedish king, the military genius who had revolutionized warfare and challenged imperial authority, died in the mud of a German field far from his northern homeland. Swedish forces, initially unaware of their king's death, continued fighting with the disciplined effectiveness that Gustavus's reforms had created. They eventually drove Wallenstein's forces from the field, claiming tactical victory in a battle that had strategic consequences far beyond its immediate military results. But their triumph was hollow. They had won the battle while losing the war's most important leader. The death of Gustavus Adolphus at Lutzen marked the end of Swedish military innovation as a dominant force in European warfare and the beginning of a new phase in the conflict that would prove even more devastating and destructive than what had come before. The Swedish king had demonstrated that imperial authority could be successfully challenged, that Wallenstein's systematic approach could be defeated, that Protestant powers could compete effectively with Catholic organization. But Gustavus had also been the only leader capable of unifying Protestant resistance and coordinating the complex political and military requirements of sustained resistance to imperial authority. His death left Swedish forces under the command of competent but conventional generals, Protestant allies without unified leadership, and the entire anti-imperial coalition vulnerable to the kind of systematic counterattack that Wallenstein understood better than anyone. The Swedish phase of the 30 Years' War had achieved remarkable military successes and demonstrated the possibility of successful resistance to Habsburg dominance, but it had not resolved the fundamental contradictions that drove the conflict. If anything, Swedish intervention had raised the stakes by proving that imperial authority was not invincible while simultaneously eliminating the only leader capable of building lasting alternatives to imperial control. As news of Gustavus's death spread across Europe, diplomats and generals began calculating the implications of a conflict that had now consumed half a generation and showed no signs of approaching resolution. The Swedish intervention had saved Protestant Germany from systematic absorption into the Habsburg Empire, but it had also demonstrated that military success alone could not resolve the political and religious contradictions that divided Europe. The war that had begun with broken glass and falling bodies, that had consumed Frederick's kingdom and Christian's ambitions, that had witnessed Wallenstein's systematic innovations and Swedish tactical brilliance, was entering its most destructive and desperate phase. The death of Gustavus Adolphus marked not the end of the conflict but the beginning of its transformation into something even more devastating, a struggle for survival in which the original religious and political issues would be subordinated to the simple question of which nations would endure and which would perish in the fires of total war. In the fog and smoke of Lutzen, as Swedish soldiers searched frantically for their fallen king and Wallenstein's forces retreated into the gathering darkness, the long winter of European warfare entered its coldest and most bitter season. Gustavus had lit hope like a torch in the darkness, and now that torch was extinguished, leaving only the flames of a continent burning itself to ash. Chapter 5. The Franco-Swedish Phase, 1635 to 1648. Here armies do not fight, here peoples die. In the shadowed chambers of the Louvre Palace, as winter rain lashed the windows of Paris, Cardinal Armand Jean du Plessis de Richelieu bent over maps of Germany with the calculating intensity of a chess master studying an endgame. The year was 1635, and Europe had been at war for 17 years. What had begun as a religious conflict between Catholic and Protestant powers had evolved into something far more complex and devastating. A systemic collapse of the old order that threatened to consume everything in its path. Richelieu was 60 years old, a man whose gaunt frame and piercing eyes reflected both intellectual brilliance and physical frailty. As cardinal and chief minister to Louis XIII of France, he wielded power that extended far beyond the borders of his kingdom. But Richelieu was more than just another ambitious cleric. He was a political theorist who understood statecraft as a science, a strategist who thought in terms of generations rather than campaigns, and a pragmatist who would sacrifice any principle for the advancement of French interests. The cardinal's decision to intervene directly in the German war represented a fundamental transformation in the conflict's nature and scope. For nearly 2 decades, France had provided covert support to Habsburg enemies while maintaining official neutrality. French gold had subsidized Protestant armies, French diplomats had negotiated anti-imperial alliances, and French agents had fomented rebellion in Habsburg territories. But direct military intervention meant crossing a line from which there could be no return. Richelieu's calculations were based on a clear understanding of European power dynamics that transcended religious considerations entirely. The Habsburg dynasty, controlling both Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, possessed resources and territory that threatened to dominate all of Europe. If the Habsburgs succeeded in consolidating their control over Germany, if they permanently crushed Protestant resistance and integrated German resources into their imperial system, then France would face encirclement by enemies possessing overwhelming superiority in population, wealth, and military potential. The cardinal's strategic vision was breathtaking in its scope and cynicism. France, officially the most Catholic kingdom in Europe, would ally with Protestant powers against Catholic Habsburgs. French armies would march alongside Swedish Lutherans and German Calvinists in the name of political balance rather than religious conviction. The war would be transformed from a struggle between competing Christian denominations into a naked contest for European supremacy. This transformation reflected broader changes in European political consciousness that the long war had accelerated. The religious passions that had motivated the conflict's early phases were giving way to more secular considerations of state interest and political survival. Princes who had once fought for the salvation of their souls now fought for the preservation of their territories. The war was becoming less about God and more about power, less about salvation and more about survival. Richelieu understood these changes better than any contemporary statesman because he had helped to create them. His political philosophy, based on raison d'etat, reason of state, subordinated all moral and religious considerations to the advancement of national interests. In Richelieu's system, states were amoral entities whose survival justified any action, however cruel or cynical. The cardinal would ally with the devil himself if it advanced French interests. The French entry into the war was carefully orchestrated to maximize strategic advantages while minimizing immediate risks. Rather than declaring war on the entire Habsburg system simultaneously, Richelieu began with limited operations designed to test imperial responses and gauge the effectiveness of French military reforms. French armies crossed into Habsburg territories at multiple points, coordinating their operations with Swedish forces that had continued fighting despite the death of Gustavus Adolphus. But the real innovation was in Richelieu's approach to coalition warfare. Unlike previous interventions that had relied on temporary alliances and shared religious convictions, French policy created permanent institutional frameworks for sustained military cooperation. The Treaty of Compiègne, signed with Sweden in 1635, established mechanisms for coordinating strategy, sharing intelligence, and distributing financial resources that would enable the anti-Habsburg coalition to sustain operations for years rather than campaigns. The systematic nature of this new phase quickly became apparent to military commanders and civilian populations alike. Previous phases of the war had witnessed periodic campaigns followed by winter truces and negotiated settlements. But the Franco-Swedish alliance created a military machine capable of sustained year-round operations that made traditional seasonal patterns obsolete. Armies no longer withdrew to winter quarters but continued fighting through snow and cold, devastating territories that had assumed they would have months to recover between campaigns. The transformation was most visible in the systematic destruction of the German countryside. Earlier armies had lived off the land sporadically and moved on, allowing communities to recover between military passages. But the new phase brought permanent military occupation, systematic taxation, and the kind of organized exploitation that Wallenstein had pioneered but that now operated on a continental scale. French quartermasters, trained in the administrative efficiency that Richelieu had brought to royal government, implemented taxation systems that extracted wealth from occupied territories with mathematical precision. Swedish commanders, building on the military innovations that Gustavus had developed, coordinated their operations with French forces to create combined arms capabilities that conventional defenses could not withstand. Together, they created a military system that was more efficient, more systematic, and more destructive than anything Europe had previously experienced. The human cost of this systematization became apparent during the campaign of 1636, as armies crisscrossed Central Europe in pursuit of strategic objectives that seemed increasingly disconnected from any rational political purpose. Villages that had survived previous military passages were systematically stripped of resources, their populations reduced to starvation or forced migration. Cities that had negotiated protection payments found themselves subjected to additional demands as military requirements escalated beyond any community's ability to meet them. The psychological impact was even more devastating than the immediate physical destruction. Civilian populations, previously able to predict military movements and prepare for periodic disruptions, found themselves trapped in a permanent state of warfare where violence could appear anywhere at any time without warning or explanation. The traditional distinction between combatants and non-combatants, already eroded by earlier phases of the conflict, virtually disappeared as armies began treating entire populations as potential resources to be exploited or obstacles to be eliminated. Imperial forces, reorganized after Wallenstein's assassination in 1634, proved incapable of matching the systematic efficiency of the Franco-Swedish alliance. Traditional Habsburg military organization, based on aristocratic privilege and regional autonomy, could not compete with forces that operated according to centralized planning and bureaucratic coordination. Spanish armies, already overstretched by commitments in the Netherlands and Italy, found themselves fighting a multi-front war against enemies who possessed superior organization and more reliable supply systems. The Battle of Rocroi in May 1643 demonstrated the military implications of these organizational advantages. French forces under the young Duke of Enghien faced Spanish armies that had dominated European battlefields for over a century. The Spanish infantry, organized in the famous tercios that had proven invincible in countless previous engagements, found themselves confronting enemies who fought according to tactical principles that made traditional formations obsolete. French artillery, positioned according to mathematical principles that Richelieu's military engineers had developed, systematically destroyed Spanish formations before they could close to effective range. French cavalry, coordinating closely with infantry and artillery support, exploited gaps in Spanish lines with precision that reflected years of systematic training. Most importantly, French logistics, organized according to bureaucratic principles that ensured regular supply deliveries, maintained operational capability throughout an extended campaign that exhausted Spanish resources. The result was not just a French victory, but the destruction of Spanish military prestige that had dominated European warfare for generations. The tercios, those disciplined infantry formations that had conquered half of Europe, were shattered by forces that understood modern warfare's requirements. Spanish military supremacy, based on individual courage and unit discipline, proved inadequate against systematic organization and technological innovation. But the real significance of Rocroi extended beyond immediate military consequences to encompass the fundamental transformation of European power relationships. Spanish decline created opportunities for French expansion, but it also eliminated one of the stabilizing forces that had maintained European balance. The systematic destruction of Spanish military capabilities meant that other powers would have to assume greater responsibilities for maintaining order, or accept the chaos that would result from the absence of effective authority. The war's character changed fundamentally during this period, becoming less a conflict between organized states than a struggle for survival among populations trapped between competing military systems. The systematic exploitation that sustained Franco-Swedish operations created refugee populations that fled from territory to territory seeking security that no longer existed anywhere. Entire regions were depopulated as communities abandoned agricultural production and fled toward fortified cities that could offer temporary protection. The economic consequences were catastrophic and self-perpetuating. Agricultural production, disrupted by military operations and systematic requisitions, fell to levels that could not sustain civilian populations. Trade networks, severed by military movements and systematic taxation, collapsed entirely in many regions. Monetary systems, strained by the costs of sustained military operations, produced inflation that made basic commodities unaffordable for ordinary people. But it was the systematic nature of the destruction that made recovery impossible. Previous wars had devastated specific regions while leaving others relatively intact, allowing for gradual rebuilding through trade and migration. The Franco-Swedish phase created a continental system of exploitation that prevented any region from accumulating the resources necessary for reconstruction. Communities that might have recovered from periodic military damages found themselves subjected to permanent taxation that prevented any possibility of economic revival. The demographic impact was equally devastating and far more permanent. Constant warfare, systematic exploitation, and the collapse of agricultural production created conditions ideal for epidemic disease. Plague, typhus, dysentery, and other infections spread through military camps and civilian populations with devastating efficiency. Contemporary records describe cities where corpses lay unburied in the streets because there were insufficient survivors to dispose of the dead. The social consequences extended far beyond immediate mortality to encompass the complete breakdown of traditional community structures. Families were scattered by military movements and economic collapse. Local governments ceased to function as tax collection became impossible and administrative personnel fled or died. Religious institutions, previously the backbone of social organization, lost their congregations and their economic foundations. The sack of Magdeburg in 1631 had shocked Europe with its random brutality, but the systematic destruction of the Franco-Swedish phase was far more devastating precisely because it was so organized, so efficient, so utterly without hope of relief. Communities subject to this systematic exploitation understood that resistance was futile, submission offered no protection, and flight provided only temporary respite before the military machine caught up with them again. The military commanders who directed these operations understood the contradiction inherent in their systematic approach. Generals like Turenne and Condé, who led French forces with brilliant tactical skill, recognized that their strategic success was destroying the very territories they sought to control. Swedish commanders, maintaining the traditions that Gustavus Adolphus had established, coordinated their operations with French forces while watching German territories become uninhabitable wastelands. But the logic of coalition warfare and competitive military pressure made it impossible to moderate the destruction. Each alliance had to extract maximum resources from occupied territories to maintain the military capabilities necessary for survival. Any coalition that reduced its exploitation of civilian populations would find itself at a disadvantage against enemies who maintained systematic extraction policies. The war had become a competition in organized brutality where moderation meant defeat and defeat meant annihilation. The psychological impact on military personnel was almost as devastating as the physical impact on civilian populations. Soldiers who had enlisted to fight for religious freedom or political liberty found themselves participating in the systematic destruction of innocent communities. Veterans who had survived decades of warfare described the Franco-Swedish phase as qualitatively different from earlier fighting, less a military campaign than an exercise in organized extinction. The officer corps that directed these operations included some of the most capable military minds of their generation, men who understood warfare as both art and science. But they were trapped within a system that had developed its own momentum, where strategic success required tactical actions that violated every traditional norm of military conduct. The war was consuming not just the territories where it was fought, but the moral foundations that had previously limited warfare's destructive potential. Religious leaders, previously among the war's most enthusiastic supporters, began questioning whether any political objective could justify the systematic destruction that military operations now required. Protestant pastors who had preached crusade against Catholic tyranny found themselves ministering to populations that had been devastated by Protestant armies. Catholic priests who had celebrated imperial victories watched Catholic territories burn under systematic exploitation by Catholic French forces. The political implications were equally profound and disturbing. The systematic destruction of Central Europe was creating a power vacuum that no existing institution could fill. The Holy Roman Empire, already weakened by decades of warfare, lost the territorial and economic foundations necessary for effective governance. Local principalities, stripped of resources by systematic military exploitation, ceased to function as meaningful political entities. Traditional systems of law and administration simply collapsed under the pressure of permanent warfare. But the alternatives were even more frightening. Military commanders possessed the organizational capabilities necessary to maintain order, but their authority was based on force rather than legitimate consent. The systematic exploitation that sustained military operations created popular hostility that made traditional governance impossible. Any attempt to restore civilian authority required resources that systematic military exploitation had already consumed. The war was creating a new form of political organization based on permanent military control and systematic resource extraction. A system that could maintain itself indefinitely through organized violence but could never create the stability necessary for genuine political reconstruction. Europe was becoming a vast military camp where survival depended on proximity to armed force and where civilian populations existed only to supply the military machine that dominated every aspect of life. International diplomacy continued throughout this period, with representatives of various powers meeting periodically to discuss potential peace settlements. But these negotiations took place in a context that made meaningful agreement virtually impossible. Each side had invested so much in the conflict, had sacrificed so much for military advantage, that compromise seemed like betrayal of those who had already died. More practically, the systematic exploitation that sustained military operations had created interests that peace would threaten. Military contractors who had grown wealthy supplying armies with equipment and provisions had obvious incentives to prolong the conflict. Regional commanders who had established virtual principalities in occupied territories resisted agreements that would restore traditional political authority. Most importantly, the systematic exploitation of civilian populations had created expectations of continued resource extraction that peacetime economic production could not possibly fulfill. The war was becoming self-perpetuating not because any party particularly wanted to continue fighting, but because the institutional structures that sustained fighting had developed their own momentum. Military organizations, bureaucratic systems, and economic relationships had evolved to serve the requirements of permanent warfare. Peace would require dismantling these structures and creating alternatives, but the process of dismantling would eliminate the very capabilities that made reconstruction possible. By the mid-1640s, As the war entered its third decade, the original religious and political issues that had motivated the conflict had become largely irrelevant to its continuation. Few participants could remember what they were fighting for, but all understood what they were fighting against: the systematic destruction that would result from defeat. The war continued because stopping required agreements that the war itself had made impossible. The human cost had become incalculable. Contemporary estimates suggest that the German territories lost between 1/3 and 1/2 of their total population during the 30 years of warfare. Some regions were virtually depopulated, their villages abandoned and their agricultural land reverting to wilderness. Cities that had been major commercial centers became ruins where a few survivors scavenged among the debris of a collapsed civilization. But statistics cannot capture the psychological and cultural destruction that accompanied the demographic catastrophe. Entire ways of life, cultural traditions that had developed over centuries, social institutions that had provided meaning and stability for countless generations, all were swept away by the systematic efficiency of military exploitation. The war was not just killing people. It was erasing the foundations of European civilization itself. Yet even as the systematic destruction continued, new forms of organization were emerging from the chaos. Military entrepreneurs who had learned to profit from warfare's opportunities were developing commercial and financial systems that transcended traditional political boundaries. Administrative innovations that had been developed for military purposes were being adapted for civilian governance. Most importantly, the experience of systematic exploitation was teaching populations new forms of resistance and cooperation that might eventually provide alternatives to military domination. The war that had begun with religious passion and political idealism was ending with bureaucratic efficiency and systematic brutality. But it was also creating the foundations for new forms of political organization that would eventually emerge from the wreckage of the old order. The Franco-Swedish phase was destroying the traditional structure of European civilization, but it was also preparing the ground for something different, though whether that something would be better or worse remained to be seen. As the 1640s progressed and exhaustion began to overcome military momentum, diplomats from across Europe gathered in the Westphalian cities of Münster and Osnabrück to begin the complex negotiations that would eventually end the war. But they would be negotiating not just the terms of peace but the fundamental structure of a new European order that would have to be built from the ashes of the old. The systematic destruction was finally approaching its limits, not because any party had achieved decisive victory, but because there was simply nothing left to destroy. The war machine that had sustained itself through organized exploitation was consuming its own foundations. Peace would come not as victory but as exhaustion, not as resolution but as admission that some problems have no solutions, only endings. Chapter 6. The Peace of Westphalia, 1648. Silence came not as blessing, but as exhaustion. In the autumn of 1648, as the first frost touched the spires of Münster and Osnabrück, delegates from across a shattered Europe gathered in these two modest Westphalian towns to perform the most complex diplomatic undertaking in human history. For 4 years, they had labored to untangle the web of grievances, claims, and counterclaims that 30 years of warfare had woven across the continent. Now, finally, they prepared to sign documents that would not merely end a war but reshape the fundamental structure of European civilization. The Münster Town Hall, where Catholic powers met to negotiate their agreements, stood solid and prosperous despite the chaos that had consumed the surrounding territories. Its Gothic windows looked out upon streets where diplomats from France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire walked carefully among each other, each representing interests that had seemed irreconcilable just months before. The very fact that these men could meet in the same building, could shake hands and share meals after decades of systematic mutual destruction, seemed like a miracle to populations that had forgotten what peace looked like. 40 miles away, in the smaller city of Osnabrück, Protestant delegations worked through the intricate details of religious settlement and territorial redistribution. Swedish representatives, inheritors of Gustavus Adolphus's legacy, sat across tables from imperial officials who had once sworn to drive every Protestant army from German soil. The Danish delegation, representing Christian IV's chastened kingdom, negotiated alongside princes who had learned that survival mattered more than any principle. The negotiations themselves were marvels of diplomatic complexity that reflected the war's transformation from religious conflict into something far more intricate and systemic. Each delegation represented not just national interests but webs of obligation and alliance that extended across multiple countries and conflicting religious traditions. French negotiators, officially representing Catholic interests, worked to protect Protestant allies whose territories provided strategic advantage against Habsburg power. Swedish diplomats, champions of Lutheran Christianity, coordinated closely with Calvinist princes whose political autonomy served Swedish strategic objectives. Cardinal Jules Mazarin, Richelieu's successor as Chief Minister of France, orchestrated French diplomatic strategy with the same systematic efficiency that had characterized French military operations. The cardinal understood that peace negotiations were warfare conducted by other means, requiring the same careful coordination of resources and objectives that had enabled French armies to dominate European battlefields. But Mazarin also recognized that peace offered opportunities that warfare could not provide: the chance to consolidate gains, legitimize conquests, and create institutional frameworks that would preserve French advantages for generations. The Swedish delegation, led by Johan Oxenstierna, son of Gustavus Adolphus's great chancellor, faced the delicate task of preserving Swedish territorial gains while extracting their forces from an increasingly expensive and unpopular intervention. Sweden had achieved remarkable military successes, but the costs of maintaining armies in Germany had strained Swedish resources beyond their breaking point. The delegation needed to negotiate a settlement that would compensate Sweden for its military investments while providing face-saving justification for withdrawal from territories that Swedish blood had conquered. Imperial negotiators, representing Ferdinand III's reduced authority, worked to salvage what remained of Habsburg control over Central Europe. The Holy Roman Empire that had once dominated European politics was barely recognizable after 30 years of systematic destruction. Its territories were occupied by foreign armies, its resources exhausted by military exploitation, its traditional authority challenged by princes who had learned to negotiate directly with foreign powers. The imperial delegation's primary objective was not restoration of previous power but preservation of sufficient authority to maintain some semblance of unified German governance. Spanish representatives faced perhaps the most difficult negotiations, as their empire confronted military defeat, financial collapse, and territorial dismemberment simultaneously. The destruction of Spanish military prestige at Rocroi had been followed by systematic French advances across multiple fronts. Spanish America continued to provide silver, but those resources were insufficient to maintain the global military commitments that Spanish imperial strategy required. The Spanish delegation needed to cut losses, preserve essential territories, and create breathing space for economic recovery. The complexity of these overlapping interests required negotiating techniques that were revolutionary in their sophistication. Rather than attempting to resolve all issues in comprehensive sessions, the delegations divided into specialized committees that addressed specific categories of problems. Territorial adjustments were negotiated separately from religious settlements, which were handled differently from commercial agreements, which required different expertise from military arrangements. The religious settlement proved particularly complex because it required balancing competing theological claims with political necessities that had little to do with doctrinal disputes. The principle of cuius regio ius religio, whose realm, his religion, was modified to permit limited religious diversity within individual territories while preventing the systematic persecution that had characterized earlier phases of the conflict. Protestant and Catholic populations would be permitted to maintain their religious practices under certain circumstances, but political authority would remain with territorial rulers regardless of their subjects' religious preferences. This compromise satisfied nobody completely but provided a framework that most parties could accept. Catholic negotiators preserved the principle of political authority over religious practice while accepting practical limitations on their ability to impose religious uniformity. Protestant delegations secured protection for existing Protestant populations while acknowledging that future religious expansion would depend on political rather than theological factors. Most importantly, the religious settlement removed theological justifications for military intervention, making future wars about territory and power rather than salvation and damnation. The territorial redistributions were equally complex and far more immediately significant for the balance of European power. Sweden received substantial monetary compensation and strategic territories that secured Swedish control over Baltic trade routes. France gained crucial frontier territories that eliminated Spanish strategic advantages and provided defensive depth against Habsburg retaliation. Various German princes received territorial adjustments that reflected their wartime alignments while creating a more complex and fragmented political structure within the Holy Roman Empire. But the most significant territorial change was what did not happen. The Holy Roman Empire was not dismantled, Habsburg authority was not eliminated, and the fundamental structure of European monarchy was preserved despite 3 decades of systematic warfare. The peace settlement represented a conservative revolution that changed everything while preserving the essential framework of traditional political authority. The constitutional arrangements that emerged from Westphalia created new forms of international organization that would influence European development for centuries. The principle of state sovereignty, the idea that territorial rulers possessed absolute authority within their domains and equal standing, regardless of their internal governance, provided a framework for international relations that transcended religious and dynastic considerations. States would interact as secular entities pursuing rational interests rather than as representatives of competing theological systems. This transformation was revolutionary in its implications for European political development. The medieval ideal of universal Christian empire, represented by the Holy Roman Empire and supported by papal authority, was replaced by a system of competing sovereign states that recognized no superior political authority. International law would be based on agreements between equals rather than hierarchical relationships ordained by divine authority. The economic provisions of the Westphalian settlement addressed the catastrophic destruction that 30 years of systematic warfare had inflicted upon Central European commerce and agriculture. Trade routes that had been severed by military operations were reopened under international guarantees. Monetary systems that had collapsed under the strain of military financing were stabilized through coordinated policies. Most importantly, the settlement created mechanisms for preventing the kind of systematic economic exploitation that had sustained military operations during the war's later phases. But these economic arrangements could not address the demographic catastrophe that 30 years of warfare had created. Contemporary estimates suggest that the German territories lost between 8 and 10 million inhabitants during the conflict, roughly 1/3 of their pre-war population. Some regions were virtually depopulated, their agricultural land reverting to wilderness and their towns abandoned to scavenging animals. The human cost of the war exceeded anything in European experience and would not be matched until the 20th century's industrial slaughter. The signing ceremonies themselves, conducted simultaneously in Münster and Osnabrück on October 24, 1648, were deliberately modest affairs that reflected the exhaustion of all participants. There were no grand celebrations, no triumphant proclamations, no claims of divine vindication. Diplomats signed their documents with the relief of men who had escaped from a burning building rather than the satisfaction of warriors celebrating victory. The peace came not because any party had achieved its original objectives, but because the costs of continued warfare had become unbearable for all participants. France had established itself as Europe's dominant land power but faced domestic rebellions that threatened royal authority. Sweden had secured its Baltic Empire but confronted financial crisis and popular war weariness. The Habsburg powers had preserved their core territories but lost the resources and prestige that had sustained their European dominance. Most German princes had survived but ruled over devastated territories that would require generations to recover. The immediate aftermath of the peace settlement revealed the complexity of transitioning from 30 years of warfare to something resembling normal governance. Armies that had sustained themselves through systematic exploitation of civilian populations had to be demobilized and integrated into peacetime society. Veterans who had known nothing but military life since childhood had to find civilian occupations in economies that had been devastated by decades of systematic destruction. Military contractors who had grown wealthy supplying armies faced financial ruin as their primary customers disappeared. The administrative challenges were equally daunting. Territorial boundaries that had been redrawn repeatedly during the war had to be surveyed and marked. Legal systems that had collapsed under military pressure had to be reconstituted. Economic relationships that had been severed by warfare had to be rebuilt from scratch. Most importantly, populations that had learned to view political authority as predatory exploitation had to be convinced that legitimate governance was possible. The psychological impact of the transition proved particularly difficult for civilians who had survived 30 years of systematic brutality. Communities that had developed survival strategies based on avoiding attention and hiding resources found it difficult to trust authorities who promised protection and justice. Families that had been scattered by military operations struggled to reconnect across territories that had been transformed beyond recognition. Children who had grown up during the war had never experienced normal civilian life and found it difficult to adapt to peacetime expectations. Religious reconciliation proved especially challenging in regions where systematic persecution had created deep communal hatreds. Catholic and Protestant populations that had been subjected to forced conversions, property confiscations, and religious violence found it difficult to resume normal social relationships despite official policies that encouraged toleration. Local religious leaders who had suffered persecution or witnessed the destruction of their congregations struggled to preach reconciliation to populations that had experienced systematic brutality. The economic recovery was slow and uneven, hampered by the systematic destruction of productive capacity that military operations had caused. Agricultural regions that had been systematically exploited required years to restore soil fertility and livestock populations. Commercial networks that had been severed by warfare could not be quickly rebuilt because the trust relationships that sustained long-distance trade had been destroyed along with the physical infrastructure. Monetary systems that had collapsed under the strain of military financing took decades to stabilize. But perhaps the most profound transformation was cultural and intellectual. The systematic nature of the war's destruction had challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between political authority and moral purpose that had underpinned European civilization for centuries. The experience of systematic brutality conducted by Christian armies in the name of Christian principles had created intellectual crises that would influence European thought for generations. Political theorists began developing new frameworks for understanding state authority that did not depend on religious justification. Philosophers questioned whether any political objective could justify the systematic destruction that modern warfare made possible. Legal scholars worked to create international law systems that might prevent future conflicts from escalating to the level of systematic brutality that the 30 Years' War had demonstrated. The military innovations that had been developed during the conflict continued to influence European warfare long after the peace settlement. The systematic approach to military organization that Wallenstein had pioneered became standard practice for all major European powers. The tactical innovations that Gustavus Adolphus had introduced were studied and copied by military academies throughout the continent. Most importantly, the systematic integration of military and economic policy that had characterized the war's later phases became a permanent feature of European state development. The demographic recovery took the longest and proved the most incomplete. Regions that had lost the majority of their population required decades to attract new settlers and restore productive capacity. Cultural traditions that had been disrupted by systematic persecution and population displacement were never fully restored. Languages and dialects that had been spoken for centuries disappeared as communities were scattered or destroyed. The peace settlement created a new European order that would endure for centuries, but it was an order born from exhaustion rather than resolution, from the admission that some conflicts have no winners rather than the triumph of any particular cause. The Westphalian system of sovereign states interacting as equals would provide the framework for European international relations until the 20th century, but it was a framework designed to prevent the resumption of systematic destruction rather than to promote any positive vision of human development. Epilogue: the silence after 30 years. An entire generation had known nothing but war. Children born in the year of the defenestration of Prague were now adults who had never experienced what their grandparents would have called normal life. The silence that settled over Central Europe in the months following the Peace of Westphalia was not the silence of contentment but the silence of exhaustion, the quiet of a continent that had fought itself nearly to death and now lay gasping in the ruins of its own making. In the villages that remained, survivors moved through their daily routines with the careful deliberation of people who had learned that any sudden movement might attract unwanted attention. They planted crops in fields where armies had camped, repaired houses with stones that had once been barricades, and tried to remember what life had been like before the sound of cannon became as familiar as church bells. But the war had changed more than the landscape. It had changed the people themselves, leaving scars that would never fully heal. The children were perhaps the most profound casualties, though they still drew breath. Boys who had learned to hide at the sound of horses, girls who had seen their homes burned and their families scattered, young people who had grown to adulthood without ever witnessing the harvest festivals, wedding celebrations, and peaceful market days that had once marked the rhythm of community life. They would carry the war within them for the rest of their lives, passing its lessons to children who had never heard gunfire but would nonetheless inherit its legacy of suspicion and silence. In Prague, where it had all begun, weeds grew in the castle courtyard where Protestant nobles had once confronted Catholic officials. The famous window from which 3 men had been thrown remained open to the sky, but few bothered to look up at it anymore. The city had survived, as cities do, but it was a different place entirely. Smaller, quieter, more careful. The grand political gestures that had once seemed so important now appeared as distant and incomprehensible as legends from a forgotten age. The maps of Europe had been redrawn, but the deeper changes were invisible to cartographers. Trust, that essential foundation of civilized life, had been systematically destroyed and would take generations to rebuild. Commercial relationships that had once spanned the continent now existed only in fragments. Cultural traditions that had flourished for centuries had been interrupted, and many would never resume. Languages that had been spoken for millennia fell silent as their speakers were scattered or killed. The war had demonstrated that human beings could adapt to almost any level of systematic brutality, could organize and rationalize and bureaucratize even the most destructive impulses. But it had also shown that some adaptations extracted prices that could never be fully paid. Europe had learned to wage war with unprecedented efficiency, but in doing so, it had forgotten how to live in peace. In the years that followed, diplomats would praise the Westphalian settlement as a triumph of negotiation over violence, a demonstration that even the most complex conflicts could be resolved through patient diplomacy. They were not wrong, but they were not complete. The peace had been possible only because there was nothing left to fight for, no resources left to sustain fighting, no population left to provide soldiers. It was the peace of the graveyard, the quiet of exhaustion rather than the harmony of resolution. The war that had begun with the sound of breaking glass and falling bodies ended not with fanfare but with whispers. Clerks recording final territorial adjustments, soldiers walking away from camps that had been their homes for decades, families tentatively venturing onto roads that had been unsafe for a generation. There were no victors, only survivors. And even they were not certain they had truly survived, for the world they inherited was so different from the one that had been destroyed that survival itself had been transformed into something unrecognizable. The broken window in Prague remained open, and the wind that blew through it carried the silence of 8 million graves across a continent that had learned, finally and at terrible cost, that some wars have no ending, only exhaustion. The 30 Years' War was over, but its lesson would echo through the centuries. When civilized people decide that their differences are worth unlimited violence, civilization itself becomes the ultimate casualty. In the end, perhaps that was the war's truest legacy. Not the new borders or the religious settlements or the diplomatic innovations, but the knowledge that human beings could create hell on earth with the same systematic efficiency they brought to any other enterprise. It was a knowledge that Europe would carry with it into the modern age. A warning written in 8 million graves that some prices are too high to pay, no matter how righteous the cause or how certain the victory. The silence settled, the survivors endured, and the world, forever changed, slowly began the long work of learning to live again.